The return of Darius Johnson. The Chicago skyline stretched across the horizon, a shimmering sea of steel and glass reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Inside the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight, Darius Johnson sat quietly by the window, his thoughts a tangled web of excitement and concern. After 6 months abroad expanding his restaurant empire, he was finally coming home. Urban Plates, his brainchild, had grown beyond his wildest dreams. What had started as a modest food truck in the heart of Chicago had flourished into a nationwide chain of restaurants, celebrated for its fusion of classic soul food with contemporary fine dining. But despite the meteoric success, a storm loomed over the company, one that Darius could no longer ignore. Alarming reports had reached him while he was overseas. Employees, especially those in lower-wage positions, were quitting in droves. Complaints of mistreatment, workplace discrimination, and outright racism had begun surfacing in company reviews and anonymous reports to HR. Darius had spent years crafting Urban Plates into a place of inclusivity, a brand that reflected the very values he had fought for as a black entrepreneur. But now, those values were being compromised under the leadership he had entrusted in his absence. His penthouse apartment was eerily silent when he arrived. The floor-to-ceiling windows provided an immaculate view of the city, but tonight he barely noticed. He placed his suitcase by the couch, his mind too restless for unpacking. Instead, he powered up his laptop and dove straight into the quarterly reports. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Revenue had surged. Customer engagement was at an all-time high. New locations were opening across the country. But beneath the glossy numbers, the truth lay buried. Employee turnover had spiked, particularly in kitchen and delivery roles, positions predominantly filled by black and immigrant workers. Then there were the complaints. Hundreds of them. Darius's fingers hovered over the trackpad as he scrolled through the feedback. I feel like I'm treated as less than human. Management acts like we don't matter. I've been screamed at for things that aren't my fault. I didn't sign up to be degraded and dismissed just because of my skin color. Each word felt like a gut punch. His business was supposed to be a beacon of hope for people like him, hardworking, ambitious, and often overlooked. Instead, it had become just another cog in a system designed to break them down. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Fiona Carter, his HR director, entered with a thick folder in hand. She was one of the few people Darius fully trusted. A veteran in the field, she had been with him since the early days, helping to craft Urban Plate's inclusive workplace policies. Fiona's face was grim as she placed the folder in front of him. "It's worse than you think," she said without preamble. Darius opened the folder, his eyes scanning the latest reports. "Tell me everything." She sighed. "We've had a surge in complaints over the past few months. Most of them come from the kitchens and delivery teams. Employees of color, especially Black and Latino workers, are reporting verbal abuse, lack of promotions, and outright discrimination from some of the senior staff." He clenched his jaw. "Why didn't I hear about this sooner?" Fiona hesitated. Some employees don't believe their voices matter, and the ones who do speak up, they're either ignored or retaliated against. Darius leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had built this company to be different, to offer people from all walks of life an opportunity to succeed. Yet here it was, falling into the same toxic patterns he had spent years fighting against. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories from his past flooding back. He remembered being a young black man trying to break into the culinary industry, working long hours in kitchens where his talent was dismissed before he even picked up a knife. He remembered being talked down to, ignored, and made to feel like he would never be good enough. That was why he had built Urban Plates, to prove that everyone, no matter where they came from, deserved a place at the table. But now, those same battles were playing out in his own kitchens. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, Darius had made his decision. He wasn't going to rely on secondhand reports or empty boardroom discussions. He needed to see the problem for himself, and the only way to do that was to go undercover. Beneath the surface, 2 days later, Darius Johnson stood outside the back entrance of Urban Plate's River North branch, dressed in a faded hoodie, worn-out jeans, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. The sharp Chicago wind bit through his clothing, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from anticipation. For years, he had built his empire from the ground up, but now he was about to step into its lowest ranks, not as the CEO, but as DJ Day, a new dishwasher. He reached the employee entrance, where a security camera blinked red above the steel door. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a wiry man in his late 40s with deep-set eyes and a permanent scowl. The name embroidered on his shirt read Carl, the assistant manager. Carl barely looked at him before jerking his thumb toward a corner of the kitchen. "Dish station's back there. Keep up, don't ask dumb questions, and don't slow us down." Darius nodded, keeping his voice low. "Got it." The kitchen was a war zone of heat, steam, and noise. The scent of sizzling garlic and seared meat clashed with the acrid tang of industrial cleaning chemicals. Pots clanged, knives thudded against cutting boards, and voices snapped orders over the chaos. Darius moved quickly to the dishwashing station, a cramped, steamy corner where dirty plates piled high like a mountain of discarded hopes. The industrial dishwasher roared beside him, spewing out blasts of hot steam as another exhausted worker scraped away food remnants with robotic precision. He turned to introduce himself, but before he could speak, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Faster, dish pit. We're not running a soup kitchen here." Darius snapped his head toward the voice. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a pristine white chef's coat stood near the prep line, his piercing blue eyes locked onto the dish station. Greg, the head chef, the same man who had been called out in multiple complaints. Greg's gaze swept over Darius before landing on the other dishwasher, an older black man with graying hair and weary eyes. "John, how many times do I have to tell you?" Greg snapped. "Stop being so damn slow. Do you need me to show you how to do your own damn job?" John hunched his shoulders and kept scrubbing. He didn't even defend himself, just kept working. Darius clenched his jaw. He had known there were problems, but seeing them firsthand was something else. He grabbed a dish, focusing on scrubbing away the stubborn grease, letting the tension in his muscles disguise his frustration. He listened, watched, observed. And what he saw was worse than he had imagined. The black and Latino workers moved differently than their white counterparts. They were quieter, their shoulders slightly hunched, their eyes downcast whenever a manager walked by. Fear, resignation, silence. Meanwhile, the white workers laughed and joked freely, occasionally tossing playful insults at one another, but never facing the same harsh scrutiny. Darius bit his tongue. This was just the first day. He had to endure this, to witness more, because if he wanted to fix this, he needed the full picture. You people. A few hours into his shift, a delivery truck pulled up to the back entrance, stacked high with boxes of fresh produce and supplies. Carl, the assistant manager, glanced around, then snapped his fingers at Darius. "DJ, go help the driver unload. Move fast. We don't have all day." Darius stepped outside, eager to escape the suffocating heat of the kitchen. The delivery driver, a stocky black man in his early 40s, wiped sweat from his brow. He sighed, clearly exhausted. "Man, they working you hard already." Darius smirked, grabbing a heavy crate of onions. "Yeah, guess you could say that." The two of them worked in silence, hauling boxes off the truck and stacking them neatly. But when they finished and the driver stepped inside to get his receipt signed, something happened. Carl muttered something under his breath. Darius heard it. "You people always take your time, don't you?" The words slithered from Carl's lips so casually, so carelessly, that Darius almost thought he had misheard. But then he saw it. The look on the driver's face. A tight, familiar expression. Anger. frustration, but most of all, restraint. The driver didn't respond. He just took the signed receipt and walked out. Darius's hands balled into fists. He could feel the slow burn of rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't done gathering evidence yet. He had to endure. The breaking point. By the time the dinner rush hit, the kitchen was drowning in chaos. Darius had been scrubbing dishes for hours, his arms sore, his hands wrinkled from water exposure. But exhaustion wasn't what wore him down. It was the constant tension. It was how the line cooks flinched whenever Greg passed by. It was how Carl sneered whenever the black employees took a second to breathe. And then, it happened. Naomi, a young black woman working the prep station, was slicing vegetables when a large delivery of ingredients arrived late. She hurried to unpack and organize them, but Greg saw an opportunity. "Jesus, Naomi, are you slow or just stupid?" Greg bellowed. Naomi froze. The entire kitchen fell silent. Darius felt the tension crackle like a storm cloud ready to burst. Greg sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "If you people can't keep up, maybe you don't belong in a kitchen." Darius stopped. He couldn't stay quiet anymore. Naomi lowered her head, gripping the edge of the counter as if trying to steady herself. The room was dead silent. Then, slowly, too slowly, Naomi nodded. "Understood, chef," she whispered. Darius couldn't take it. Before he knew what he was doing, he slammed down a tray of dishes louder than necessary, making everyone jump. Greg's icy gaze snapped at him. "You got a problem, dish boy." Darius stared him down, but he didn't say a word. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to his work, hiding the fire burning inside him. This wasn't over. Later that night, Darius walked home, the cold night air barely cooling his frustration. Every moment from that shift replayed in his mind. The delivery driver's silence, the black worker's hunched shoulders, Naomi's forced obedience, Greg's cruelty, Carl's racism. He had enough. He had seen enough. Darius had built urban plates to be different, to be better. And yet, it was failing. He wouldn't let this continue. By the time he reached his penthouse, his mind was already racing with ideas. He wouldn't just fire a few people and call it a day. No, this needed to be bigger. He needed to tear this system down from the inside. It was time to expose the rot at the heart of his empire. The road to truth. Darius Johnson had spent a week washing dishes at his own restaurant, witnessing firsthand the rot that had infected the foundation of urban plates. But what he had seen wasn't enough. It wasn't just the kitchen. It wasn't just Greg, the head chef, humiliating black and Latino workers. It wasn't just Carl, the assistant manager, casually dropping racist remarks. It was the entire system. The culture that treated certain workers as disposable, that overworked them, dismissed them, and broke them down until they either quit or learned to suffer in silence. And now, Darius needed to see more. He needed to go deeper. That's why, early the next morning, he was standing in front of the River North Urban Plates distribution hub, dressed in the uniform of a delivery driver. His name tag read DG Day. And today, he wasn't the CEO. He was just another worker. The broken system. The first thing he noticed as he walked into the delivery hub was the smell of oil and exhaust, mixed with the bitter tang of cheap coffee and exhaustion. Dozens of drivers milled about, most of them black or immigrants, all of them looking overworked and underpaid. A grizzled, middle-aged driver with a heavy accent sighed next to him, stretching his arms. "Man, another long day." He muttered to no one in particular. Darius turned to him. "How long you been working here?" The man chuckled dryly. "Too long." Before Darius could ask anything else, a short, stocky man in a manager's uniform stormed in, clipboard in hand. Dennis, the night shift manager. He had the kind of face that always looked mildly pissed off, like he hated every second of his job. "All right, listen up, "You useless sacks of crap," Dennis barked. "I need no screw-ups today. That means no excuses, no delays, and if any of you get a complaint, you're off the schedule for the week." Darius barely stopped himself from rolling his eyes. There it was again. The same condescension. The same disrespect. Dennis wasn't even pretending to treat the workers like human beings. Instead of answering any questions or giving the drivers useful information, he just started tossing clipboards at them, calling out names at random. "Tarek, you're on the south side today. Marcia, you got the corporate clients." Then, Dennis glanced at Darius and sneered. "New guy. DJ, you're taking the old van." Darius blinked. "Wait, the old van." Before he could ask what that meant, Dennis threw a set of rusty keys at him. "Yeah, the one with the broken heating and the messed up brakes," Dennis said with a smirk. "Try not to crash it, yeah." Some of the other drivers chuckled quietly. Not because it was funny. Because they had all been through the same thing. Darius felt a familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he forced himself to stay in character. He nodded, took the keys, and walked to the parking lot. And when he saw the van, his stomach dropped. It was barely holding together. The logo was peeling off. The tires were almost bald. And the inside, rust, dust, and the faint smell of something that might have died weeks ago. Meanwhile, across the lot, a white driver, one of the few, was climbing into a brand new company van. It didn't take a genius to see the pattern. The black and immigrant drivers got the worst vehicles. The white drivers got the best. Darius inhaled sharply and clenched his fists. He was done watching. It was time to experience it firsthand. He climbed into the old van, turned the key, and after 2 painful tries, the engine coughed to life. His first stop was a corporate office downtown, one of Urban Plate's biggest customers. He parked the van and grabbed the heavy food bags, double-checking the order, just like he had trained his workers to do. Then he walked toward the entrance. And that's when it happened. The disrespect. The security guard at the front entrance, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a stiff blue uniform, barely glanced at him before pointing toward the back alley. "Deliveries in the back," he said coldly. Darius froze. He knew that tone. The tone that said, "You don't belong here." But he forced a tight smile, nodded, and walked toward the side entrance. His hands gripped the food bags tighter. By the time he made it inside, his arms were aching from the extra distance he had to walk just because the security guard didn't want a black delivery driver walking through the front. He approached the front desk, where a blonde receptionist barely looked up from her phone. "I have a delivery for Sterling & Co., Darius said. She sighed like he was an inconvenience. "Leave it on the counter," she muttered. "No thank you. No eye contact. Just dismissal." Darius set the bags down carefully, even though every muscle in his body wanted to slam them down. "Have a good day," he said, forcing the words out. The receptionist ignored him. By the time he walked out of the building, his hands were shaking. A driver's reality. By the end of the night, Darius had made 6 more deliveries. Every single one of them told the same story. White customers hesitated before opening the door when they saw him. Black drivers were sent to the worst neighborhoods. Immigrant workers were yelled at for the smallest mistakes. Managers treated them like trash. At his last stop, he saw Marcia, the middle-aged black woman who had been working as a driver for 3 years, get berated by Dennis. "Marcia, you're late again," Dennis barked. "If you can't handle this job, maybe you shouldn't have one." Marcia, exhausted, tried to explain. "My van broke down on the highway." Dennis laughed. "Excuses, excuses," he sneered. "Just do better." Darius's fingers curled into fists. This was it. He had enough. The breaking point. That night, Darius didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove to one of his restaurant's headquarters, his real office. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and started typing. Every incident, every insult, every racist remark, every unfair policy. The next morning, he called his HR director, Fiona. "Schedule an emergency meeting," he told her. Fiona's voice sounded hesitant. "Darius, what's going on?" Darius exhaled. His voice was firm, unshakable. "I went undercover," he said. "I've seen everything." Silence. Then Fiona whispered, "Oh my God." "Yeah," Darius muttered. "And now, I'm about to burn this system to the ground." The reckoning. The morning sun barely pierced through the thick winter clouds hanging over Chicago's business district, casting a dull gray hue over the city. But inside the sleek, glass-walled headquarters of Urban Plates, the air was anything but dull. Tension crackled in the conference room like static electricity before a storm. Darius Johnson sat at the head of the long, polished oak table, his fingers drumming against the surface in controlled impatience. Across from him sat the senior management team, the executive chefs, the regional managers, the HR department, and most importantly, the problem makers. The ones responsible for the abuse, the discrimination, the disrespect that had turned Urban Plates into something he no longer recognized. The ones he had witnessed firsthand. Greg, the head chef from River North, leaned back in his chair with a smirk, arms folded across his broad chest. Carl, the assistant manager, twitched his nose like he had somewhere better to be. Dennis, the delivery manager, sipped his coffee, looking bored. The others exchanged nervous glances, clearly sensing that something was about to go down. At the far end of the table sat Fiona Carter, Darius's HR director. She met his gaze, nodding slightly. She had been briefed on what he had uncovered. And now, it was time for the reckoning. "I know everything." Darius took a slow breath and placed a thick stack of papers on the table. The entire room watched as he let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in their own discomfort. Finally, he spoke. "I went undercover." It was only 4 words, but they hit like a bomb. Silence. Then a few startled shifts. Dennis, the delivery manager, frowned. "What the hell do you mean?" Darius leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto them. "For the past 2 weeks, I worked in my own restaurants. I scrubbed dishes. I drove deliveries. I worked under your leadership. And I saw everything." Carl stiffened, his face turning pale. Greg scoffed. "So what? You wanted to play dishwasher for a few days. That doesn't mean you." Slam. Darius slammed his palm on the table. Everyone jumped. His voice, when he spoke, was sharp as a blade. "I heard you, Greg." His eyes burned into the head chef. "I watched you berate and humiliate my employees. I heard you call them lazy. I saw how you treated the Black and Latino workers like garbage while letting your white staff slide." Greg's face twisted. "That's not true. Shut up." Greg's mouth snapped shut. Darius's voice cut through the air like thunder. "Carl, I heard you call a delivery driver you people. I watched you dismiss your Black staff like they were invisible. I saw how you treated them like second-class citizens while acting buddy-buddy with your white employees." Carl's face burned red. I didn't mean it like." Darius ignored him. His focus shifted to Dennis, the delivery manager. "Dennis, I saw how you gave the best vans and easiest routes to white drivers while forcing Black and immigrant workers to use broken-down vehicles. I saw how you laughed when Marcia, one of your most loyal drivers, told you her van stalled on the highway." Dennis went rigid. The weight of Darius's words was crushing the air out of the room. But he wasn't done. The evidence. Darius grabbed the thick stack of papers and flipped through them. "These are employee complaints." He tossed one onto the table. "Here's one from Maoni, a prep cook at River North. She's been working there for 2 years and was never given a promotion." "But Greg," Darius shot the head chef a cold glare, "you promoted a white line cook after only 6 months." Another paper hit the table. This is from Tarek, one of our delivery drivers. He asked for a shift change because his mother is sick. Dennis, you told him. If you don't like it, there's the door. Another. This is from John, a dishwasher at River North. He's been verbally abused for months. I saw it myself. Greg, you screamed at him in front of everyone. One by one, Darius threw the truth onto the table. Their silence was deafening. Fiona finally spoke, her voice icy. These aren't just bad leadership practices. They're HR violations. And frankly, some of these are grounds for lawsuits. Carl gulped. Dennis sank lower in his seat. Greg looked like he was about to explode. Change is coming. Darius stood, both palms pressed against the table. His next words were final. This company was built on the idea that everyone, no matter their background, deserves respect. His voice echoed in the silent room. But right now, we're failing. A heavy pause. Then the hammer dropped. Starting today, things will change. He turned to Fiona. A full HR audit will begin immediately. Any manager caught engaging in discriminatory behavior will be terminated. Greg jerked in his seat. You can't be serious. Greg, you're fired. Silence. The entire room froze. Greg's face turned an ugly shade of red. You can't just. Darius's voice was calm, unshakable. I own this company. I can do whatever the hell I want. Greg pushed back his chair violently, storming out of the room. Darius didn't spare him a second glance. Instead, he turned to Carl and Dennis. You two are on probation. If I hear even a whisper of mistreatment, you're gone. Dennis swallowed hard, nodding. Carl mumbled something under his breath, but didn't argue. Darius continued. We're implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for every employee. We're creating a safe, anonymous reporting system. Every worker will be given a voice, and if you can't handle that. His eyes swept the room. Then you can get the hell out. Silence. The managers shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Fiona closed her folder, looking up at them. Any questions? She asked, voice sharp. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The aftermath. As the meeting ended, the managers shuffled out, whispers buzzing between them. But Darius wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about his employees. Naomi, Tarek, John, Marcia. People who had given their blood, sweat, and tears to Urban Plates. And starting today, they would finally be treated like they mattered. As he walked out of the conference room, he exhaled for the first time in days. This was just the beginning. But for the first time, in a long time, Darius felt like he was on the right path. The reckoning. No more second chances. The air in the conference room was heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Darius Johnson had just dropped the hammer on the toxic culture poisoning Urban Plates. He had fired Greg, the racist head chef, put Carl and Dennis on probation, and announced a complete overhaul of how his company treated its employees. But he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about removing the worst offenders. This was about ensuring that no one like them would ever hold power in his business again. Making it clear, no more excuses. Darius's eyes scanned the remaining managers, his voice steady, firm, and final. I want to make something crystal clear. This is not a warning. This is not a one-time fix. If any of you think you can go back to business as usual once this meeting is over, you are dead wrong. No one dared to speak. Carl, still pale from being put on probation, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dennis stared down at his coffee cup, his knuckles white against the ceramic. Several other managers sat rigidly, avoiding eye contact. Fiona leaned forward, her gaze sharp. We're also implementing an anonymous employee reporting system. Any complaints that come through will go directly to HR and to me. She paused. And if they're serious enough, they'll go straight to Darius. Darius nodded, which means if anyone here thinks they can keep doing things the way they have been, you won't just lose your job. He let the words sink in. I will make sure you never work in this industry again." That got their attention. Even the ones who had stayed silent now looked visibly shaken. This wasn't just about company policy anymore. This was personal, confronting the hidden resistance. Suddenly, one of the regional managers, Patrick, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Patrick was one of the older managers, a guy who had been working in the restaurant industry for over 20 years. He had always been respectful to Darius's face, but right now, his expression was full of quiet defiance. "This is all good in theory," Patrick said, voice calm but edged with something dangerous. "But let's be honest, Darius. You're making a big deal out of nothing. There's always going to be some unhappy workers. That's just how the business works." Darius went still. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He had expected this. Not everyone was going to come around. Some of them, like Patrick, had benefited from this toxic system, and now that Darius was tearing it down, they were pushing back. Darius stood slowly, placing both palms flat on the table, leaning in slightly. "Patrick," he said, his voice smooth but dangerously controlled, "tell me, when was the last time you worked a shift in one of my restaurants?" Patrick frowned, caught off guard. "What?" Darius tilted his head. "You heard me. When was the last time you actually got in the kitchen, worked the line, cleaned dishes, or handled deliveries?" Patrick's jaw tightened. "I don't need to," he muttered. "I've been managing restaurants for years. I know how it works." Darius chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You don't know shit." The room tensed. Darius picked up one of the complaints from the stack. "This is from an employee in one of your locations. Do you know what it says?" Patrick didn't answer. Darius read it aloud. "Patrick never listens to us. When we bring up issues, he says, 'If you don't like it, quit.' He schedules black and immigrant employees for the hardest shifts and refuses to promote anyone unless they're his friend. We are invisible to him." Darius slapped the paper onto the table. Patrick shifted uncomfortably. "I don't recall ever saying that," he muttered. Darius's expression didn't change. "I believe them more than I believe you." Patrick's face darkened. Darius continued, cold and unrelenting. "So let me make it simple. If you don't believe in what I'm doing, if you don't think change is needed, if you think your power is more important than the people who make this company successful," a beat of silence, "then leave." Patrick's jaw tightened. "You're seriously telling me to?" "Yes," Darius cut him off. "I am. Get out." Silence. Patrick sat there, stiff with anger, like he was about to argue. Then, finally, he pushed back his chair and stood. Without another word, he walked out of the room. Darius didn't watch him leave. Instead, he looked at the remaining managers, his voice low and deadly calm. "Anyone else?" Silence. No one moved. "Good. Setting the standard." Fiona nodded approvingly. "Now that we've gotten rid of the dead weight, let's talk next steps." Darius straightened, rolling his shoulders. "We're rebuilding this company from the ground up," he said. "All managers will be required to undergo leadership and diversity training. Promotions will be based on performance, not favoritism. A new transparent pay structure will be created. Black and immigrant employees will finally get a fair shot at leadership roles. And the most important change: Darius would personally visit every location, unannounced, every month. I'm not going to be some CEO sitting in a glass office while my people suffer, Darius said, his voice strong. I'll be there. I'll be watching. And if anyone tries to bring back what we just tore down, his eyes swept the room. They'll be gone before they can blink. The managers nodded. Some still looked hesitant, but most. They looked like they were finally understanding that this wasn't just a policy change. This was a revolution. The first victory. As the meeting ended, the managers shuffled out, whispers buzzing between them. But Darius wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about his employees. Naomi, Tarek, John, Marcia, people who had given everything to Urban Plates. And now, they were finally getting what they deserved. As he stood in the now empty conference room, Fiona stepped up beside him. "That was the best damn meeting I've ever been in," she said with a smirk. Darius exhaled, running a hand over his face. "We're just getting started." Fiona nodded. "But we're finally on the right path." For the first time in a long time, Darius believed it. Rebuilding the empire. The toxic leadership was gone. The worst offenders, Greg, Patrick, and others like them, had been removed. The old way of doing things, where black and immigrant workers were treated as second-class citizens, where favoritism decided promotions, and where discrimination thrived in silence, was over. But Darius Johnson knew that firing bad managers wasn't enough. Real change wasn't just about cutting out the rot. It was about rebuilding something better. And that was going to be the hardest part yet. A message to the employees. Darius didn't want his employees hearing about the changes through whispers and rumors. He wanted them to hear it from him. So, the day after the emergency meeting, he stood in front of the Urban Plates headquarters, facing a crowd of over 200 employees from different locations. The moment he stepped onto the small stage, the whispers started. They knew who he was. But after weeks of going undercover, they also knew that he had been one of them. Darius took a deep breath, scanning the crowd, dishwashers, cooks, servers, delivery drivers, all watching him with cautious eyes. Then he spoke. "I won't waste your time. You all know me as the CEO of Urban Plates, but for the past few weeks, I wasn't your CEO. I was a dishwasher. I was a delivery driver. I worked alongside you. I saw what you go through every day." Silence. Tense. Waiting. Darius let the words hang in the air before he continued. "And what I saw, it disgusted me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Darius held up a hand, and the voices quieted. "I saw managers scream at hardworking employees. I saw black and immigrant workers treated like they didn't matter. I saw people afraid to speak up because they thought no one would listen." His voice hardened. "That is not who we are. That is not the company I built." The employees watched him carefully, some still skeptical, some cautiously hopeful. Darius stepped forward, his voice clear. "So here's what's happening. Racist and abusive managers, gone. A new reporting system, in place. Promotions, based on merit, not favoritism. Wages, increasing for kitchen and delivery workers. Employees, given a seat at the table. Their voices will be heard." The crowd stirred. Some exchanged wide-eyed looks. Some nodded, slow and cautious. Then a voice called out from the back. An older black man, his arms crossed. "How do we know this ain't just talk?" Darius met his gaze, unwavering. "Because I'm not just saying this. I'm proving it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a contract. A new initiative, an employee council, a group of workers from all levels, dishwashers, delivery drivers, cooks, who would have direct meetings with upper management every month. Not just to voice concerns, but to make decisions. "This company doesn't belong to just me," Darius said, his voice steady. "It belongs to you. You're the reason it succeeds. And from now on, you have power here." A beat of silence. Then, a single clap. Then another. Then, applause. It wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't thunderous. But it was real. And Darius knew that was enough for now. Rewriting the rules. The next few weeks were a battlefield of change. Not everyone was happy about it. Some regional managers resisted the new hiring policies. Some executives thought Darius was being too radical. But he didn't care. He met with every employee willing to talk to him. Naomi, the talented prep cook, was promoted to head chef. Tariq, the Somali driver, was given a leadership position in logistics. John, the quiet dishwasher who had endured months of verbal abuse, was now supervising his own team and training new hires. For the first time in Urban Plate's history, leadership wasn't just white and privileged. It was diverse, experienced, and built from the ground up. But Darius still had one more battle to fight. Confronting the investors. Urban Plates had dozens of investors, and not all of them cared about morality and fairness. They cared about money. And when word spread about Darius firing senior management and increasing wages, the boardroom filled with angry voices. "This is reckless, Darius," one of the older investors snapped. "You can't just increase wages across the board. Do you know how much that will cut into profits?" Darius leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I know exactly how much." He pushed a spreadsheet across the table, a detailed financial projection. And the truth was clear. Yes, wages were increasing. Yes, diversity programs were being introduced. Yes, toxic managers were being fired. But profits weren't dropping. They were rising. Because when workers are valued, respected, and motivated, they'd work harder. Customer satisfaction skyrockets, and Urban Plates was making more money than before. Silence settled over the boardroom. Darius locked eyes with the room full of wealthy investors. If anyone has a problem with making money while treating people with basic human dignity, you're free to pull out your investments today. No one moved. No one dared. After a long beat, one of the biggest investors, a quiet but influential woman, nodded approvingly. "I like it," she said. "You're building something real." That was all it took. The resistance crumbled. Darius had won. A new beginning. 1 month later, things were different. Workers had a voice. Managers were held accountable. Wages were fair. And for the first time, employees actually felt proud to work at Urban Plates. Darius walked into the River North location, where it all started. The energy was different. The employees looked at him differently, not like some distant CEO, but as one of them. Naomi, now head chef, grinned at him, finally decided to visit without a dishwashing uniform. Darius laughed. "Figured I'd give you all a break." He looked around. The restaurant was thriving. And for the first time, in a long time, so was he. Urban Plates wasn't just a business anymore. It was a legacy. And this time, it was built to last. 1 year later, a legacy reborn. 1 year had passed since Darius Johnson tore down the toxic empire that had poisoned Urban Plates. 1 year since he fired the racist managers, restructured leadership, and rebuilt his company from the ground up. 1 year since he proved that you can run a successful business without exploiting people. Now, Urban Plates was thriving like never before. And today, Darius was walking into the biggest moment of his career. The day everything changed. The air inside the Urban Plates National Conference Hall was electric. The entire company, managers, chefs, dishwashers, drivers, cashiers, regional leaders, had gathered for the company's first ever employee summit. For the first time in the company's history, every single worker had a voice here. No more faceless corporate speeches. No more empty leadership meetings. Every level of the company was present. At the front of the stage, Fiona Carter, now the official vice president of employee relations, stood confidently at the podium. She looked over the packed crowd, over 2,000 employees from every Urban Plates location across the country, and smiled. "I think we can all agree. It's been a hell of a year." The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter. She let them settle before continuing. 1 year ago, this company was at a breaking point, but because of all of you, because of the people in this room, we didn't just fix it. We made it better. The applause grew louder. She glanced toward the side of the stage, where Darius stood, watching. Then she grinned. "And there's only one person who can tell you how far we've come. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our CEO, Darius Johnson." The CEO who was once a dishwasher. As Darius stepped onto the stage, the entire room stood up. A standing ovation. Not because he was the CEO, not because he was the boss, but because he had earned their respect. He raised his hands, motioning for the crowd to settle. "A year ago," he began, voice steady, "I stood in front of many of you and made a promise. I promised that this company would change, that people would finally be treated with dignity, that leadership would be held accountable, that no one would be invisible anymore." He paused, scanning the room. And we did it. The room erupted in cheers. Darius held up a new company report in his hands. Before, our employee turnover rate was one of the worst in the industry. Today, it's one of the lowest. The crowd cheered again. Before, complaints about discrimination and mistreatment were ignored. Today, those complaints are investigated immediately, and justice is served. More applause. Before, leadership was an exclusive club for the privileged. Today, 63% of our managers, chefs, and executives come from diverse backgrounds, including the very employees who worked their way up. At that, several newly promoted managers stood, cheering. Naomi, the prep cook who had been humiliated by Greg, was now one of the head chefs leading the company's expansion into new locations. Tarek, the Somali driver who had been given the worst shifts, was now a regional director overseeing fair scheduling for all drivers nationwide. John, the dishwasher who had been abused for years, was now leading new employee mentorship programs. And Marcia, the middle-aged black woman who had been bullied by Dennis, was now the head of Urban Plate's new delivery operations team. The people who had once been ignored were now the ones shaping the future. And then, Darius dropped the biggest bombshell of the day. "You're no longer just employees." Darius stepped forward, looking at the thousands of people who had made this possible. And then he smiled. "Today, Urban Plates becomes the first national restaurant chain in America to make every single employee a shareholder in the company." Silence. A heartbeat. Then, the room exploded. Employees were on their feet, cheering, clapping, crying. Because for the first time in any of their lives, they weren't just workers filling shifts. They were owners, stakeholders, people who mattered. Darius raised his hands again. "From this day forward, every employee will receive annual stock in the company. The longer you stay, the more you earn. When this company grows, you grow with it. When it succeeds, you succeed." The room shook with applause. Fiona wiped a tear from her eye. Naomi had her hands over her mouth, in shock. Tariq and Marcia hugged each other, laughing in disbelief. John wiped his face, overcome with emotion. For so many years, they had been told they were replaceable, that they were just numbers in a system. But today, they had been given power, and no one could take it from them again. The final promise. As the applause died down, Darius took a deep breath. He wasn't just a CEO today. He was part of something bigger. "We're not done yet." His voice was strong, unwavering. "This is only the beginning. Urban Plates will become a model for how businesses should run, where people are valued, where diversity isn't just a word, it's a reality, where leadership isn't about power, it's about lifting others up." He looked at the thousands of faces watching him, knowing that these were the people who had fought for this moment. And then he said the words that would define Urban Plates forever. "We're not just making money, we're making history." The room shook with applause one final time. Because this was more than a business now. This was a movement. And Darius Johnson had built a legacy that would never be forgotten.